Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're joining us today because we're diving straight into something so deeply personal and honestly a universal kind of ache, unexplained hardship. You absolutely know the exact feeling I'm talking about, right? It's that awful moment when life just takes a massive, sudden turn. The ground literally falls out from under you and you're just left sitting there in the dark trying to hold all the pieces together.
Why is this happening to me? Look, it's a question every single one of us asks eventually. And usually it hits you right at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling. It comes after something you totally didn't see coming. A phone call out of nowhere, a sudden loss, just a massive tectonic shift in your reality. And in that moment, we desperately want an answer. When that unexpected pain hits, we want God to just show up right there in the room with us. Pull up a chair and explain himself. We want the logic. We want to know why.
Well, here's what's really fascinating about this. If you've ever asked God a question that he hasn't answered yet, you're definitely not alone. There's a guy in the Bible who asked that exact same question, and he asked it louder and longer than literally anyone else in history. His name was Job, and he asked it for 40 chapters. 40. He's just demanding an answer, pouring out all this raw grief, desperately trying to understand the sudden, complete collapse of his entire world. And you know what happens when God finally does show up? He doesn't answer him. Not once. Not a single explanation. So we're left with a choice, right? Either God is being incredibly cruel, or we have completely misunderstood what the story of Job is actually all about. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at how this story is set up, because it uses massive dramatic irony. So picture this. On side A, we have what the reader sees. As we read chapters 1 and 2, we actually get this behind-the-scenes VIP pass to the heavenly courtroom. We see this whole conversation between God and the accuser. But over on side B, what does Job see? Absolutely nothing. Total zero. Job doesn't get a front row seat to the heavens. All he experiences is losing absolutely everything he loves in a single afternoon for reasons he's never ever going to be told.
And this right here, this is the crucial point. It's the core tension of the entire book. Job was never invited into the decision. He's about to spend 40 long, agonizing chapters demanding an explanation for a cosmic conversation he wasn't allowed to witness. Just imagine the sheer crushing weight of that for a second. You've lost your livelihood, your kids, your health, and you are completely in the dark. Let's just sit in that for a beat. Because so often, we rush to comfort people. But Job just had to sit in the ashes.
Which brings us to the danger of tidy theology, and specifically Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. A lot of times, religious traditions just kind of skip over these guys, or they flatten them out into these two-dimensional villains. But here's the thing, they aren't monsters. They're just terrified people. They do what a lot of religious people do. When they can't stand watching suffering that they can't explain, they build a theology that makes it logical. They tell Job, look, you must have sinned, because to them, suffering is always payback. They so desperately need to believe that God is always fair in this really predictable, measurable way.
But you see, their theology left absolutely no room for a good man to suffer for no reason at all. And that was the inherent problem, because that was exactly what was happening right in front of their eyes. Their theology wasn't wrong because they were just trying to be mean and cruel. It was wrong because it was way too tidy. It was this neat little box, and messy, unmerited suffering, it just didn't fit inside. When you try to force profound, totally unexplained pain into a simple little equation, the framework cracks. Every time.
Which brings us to this incredibly important realization. If you take anything away from our explainer today, please let it be this. Sometimes the most unbiblical thing you can possibly do is insist you already understand why God does what he does. It is so dangerous to force easy answers onto profound pain. When we pretend we have the cosmic blueprint all figured out, we aren't actually defending God. We're usually just protecting our own fragile need for control. Job's friends? They thought they were defending God, but man, they were actually missing the point entirely.
Section 3. The twist. When God finally speaks. Let's see what happens next.
So you're reading through dozens of chapters of Job and his friends just arguing back and forth. It's building up to this massive confrontation in chapters 38 through 41, and you're fully expecting God to show up and finally hand over the spreadsheet of reasons, right? You expect the grand why. But the massive twist of the story is that when God speaks out of the storm, he never once answers why. Instead, he asks Job a question. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? It is this majestic, overwhelming barrage of questions. God doesn't defend himself. He totally shifts the perspective. He just points to the massive scale of the universe, setting the entire architecture of the cosmos right in front of a grieving man.
And then he asks this, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Now,
The Pleiades is a star cluster that's literally light years across. Just think about the sheer vastness of that question for a second. God is pulling Job's vision up out of the ashes and forcing him to look up at the night sky. And we really shouldn't try to over-explain this part. We just need to let the magnitude of that question breathe. God is mapping out a universe that operates on a scale so far beyond human comprehension.
And then, right after that, he completely shifts gears. He goes from the cosmic scale all the way down to the microscopic. He asks, "Do you know when the mountain goats give birth?" It's just such an incredibly intimate, tiny detail of nature. God knows the massive, burning stars, and he knows the quiet, unseen moments of wild mountain goats. He possesses this unsearchable wisdom that governs absolutely everything, from expanding galaxies all the way down to the smallest, most hidden breath of life on Earth.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real takeaway here. Because God isn't doing this just to flex or show off. The point is actually so much quieter and a whole lot more profound. It's simply this: you don't have the shelf space for the answers yet. Sometimes answers aren't being withheld to punish us. They're withheld because an infinite truth simply cannot fit inside a finite human mind. We literally just don't have the capacity. We don't have the shelf space to hold the why.
And look at how Job responds to all of this. His response isn't defeat. It's actually profound relief. He says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." He didn't get his answer. He never got the why. But he realized that he got something he needed infinitely more than that. He got God's presence. Just the realization that the God of the cosmos was willing to actually speak to him in the middle of his pain, that was enough. The presence of God answered the ache that an explanation never ever could have fixed anyway.
Which brings us to our final thought today. If you're sitting there right now navigating your own 2 a.m. questions, if you're waiting on an explanation God hasn't given you for a really heavy, very real ache, I want you to know you're in incredibly good company. Because Job never got his explanation either. You see, faith was never meant to be certainty about why. It was meant to be trust in who. So maybe the question we're left with, right in the middle of our own storms, isn't God, why did you let this happen? But rather, God, are you in the room with me while it does?